This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nietzsche, and today I'm bringing you part 2 of my Adventures in the Forgotten Realms limited review. This time around I'm doing the review in fewer videos because the amount of time between the full set reveal and it being available online is very small. In fact, you'll be able to play the format on Arena tomorrow, and that's also when this review will be completed. So, yesterday we took a look at all the multicolored, colorless, and white cards, and today we're looking at blue and black. Keep in mind, this is a limited review, and I'm not talking about other formats. Also, I use a letter grade system to help me sum up my thoughts on each card, and if you aren't sure what the grades mean, you'll find a guide in the description. Alright, let's get started with blue, where our first card is Aberrant Mind Sorcerer, which for 4 generic and a blue is a 3/4 human elf shaman at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard, then roll a d20. And if you roll a 1 through 9, you put that card on top of your library, and if you roll a 10 through 20, you return that card to your hand. So, yeah, this is the first card we've seen with a d20 effect. It's a thing in this set, and it's going to really be pronounced in the blue-red archetype, but it shows up all over the place. And yes, it just literally means you roll a d20, which is not a spin-down counter, by the way. You have to roll an actual d20, which is organized a little bit differently. Anyway, this looks pretty nice. 10 to 20 is the preferable option, obviously enough, and you do have a higher chance of getting that. And the 1 through 9 part isn't terrible. Returning a removal spell to the top of your library is some pretty powerful card selection. If you always got the 10 to 20 effect, it would be a B, and if you always get the 1 through 9, it would probably be like a C+, and I think we can split the difference there and give this a B-. Next up, it's Air Cult Elemental, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a 2/5 elemental at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand. And I think I forgot to mention on the previous card, this set has these keyword ability looking things like Whirlwind here. They're actually just flavor words. They don't actually recur. You're not going to have other cards with similar abilities. It's just a flavor word to make these cards feel more flavorful. Anyway, this is one big mana war. A 6-mana 2/5 flyer isn't a very good rate, but because this bounces another creature, you'll often feel like you're getting your mana's worth. If you know me, you know I always love this kind of effect, and there's a reason for that. It's great and limited. Adding to your board while subtracting from your opponents is one of the best feelings you can have. And yeah, while the 2/5 stats aren't exactly incredible, nor is the 6 cost, it is enough that the elemental can still be a little bit of a threat in the sky or be an effective blocker. You can also use it to bounce your own creature, which comes up sometimes. It does cost 6 mana, so you don't really want more than one of them, but I think I'm going to go after the first copy relatively highly. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Arcane Investigator, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 elf wizard at common. And it has an activated ability where you can pay 5 generic and a blue and roll a d20. If you get 1 through 9, you draw a card, and if you get 10 through 20, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. A 2-mana 2/1 isn't so good these days, but this one does come with a pretty powerful late-game effect. No matter what you roll, being able to draw cards late is pretty nice. Still, for the bulk of the game, the Investigator is just not very good. It will be outclassed quickly in the early game, and in the mid-game, it will be even more useless. I think that makes it hard to give it more than a C-. Next up, it's Bar the Gate, which for 2 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says counter target creature or planeswalker spell, venture into the dungeon. And the dungeons are what I'm showing on the screen here. I'm going to talk about them a little bit here because it's the first time they've come up in this video. These are interesting cards because they aren't actually cards you draft. They're not like lessons in that sense. Instead, they're cards that just exist outside of the game that you always have access to, and when you have a card with Venture, like Bar the Gate here, you pick one of these, if you haven't already, ventured into a dungeon, and you get the effect in the very first room of the dungeon. And then, on subsequent ventures, you get to choose what room to go to next, if your rooms are connected. And you can see that Lost Mine of Phandelver and Tomb of Annihilation can be completed a lot more quickly than Dungeon of the Mad Mage, but Dungeon of the Mad Mage has way more value that you can grind out, and it has a really powerful effect at the very end. So if you're trying to grind out a bunch of value with a dungeon, Dungeon of the Mad Mage is the way to do it. If you're trying to complete a dungeon quickly, it's Lost Mine of Phandelver and Tomb of Annihilation that you're probably going to want, and there are cards that care about you completing dungeons, so it does come up sometimes. Anyway, Bar the Gate seems like a pretty solid counterspell. They always come with big downsides, like how situational they are, and 3 mana for one is normally not a card you really want to play. But when some additional value is added on to counter magic, it becomes increasingly worth it, and I do think that's what we have here. Sure, it doesn't counter everything, but creatures are the most common thing your opponent will cast, so it will often have targets. Venturing into the dungeon isn't quite draw a card most of the time, but it gets close enough that I'm actually pretty interested in the first copy of this for most blue decks. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's the Black Staff of Waterdeep, which for 1 blue is a rare legendary artifact, and you can choose not to untap it during your untap step, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 1 generic and a blue and tap it. And another target non-token artifact you control becomes a 4/4 artifact creature for as long as the Black Staff of Waterdeep remains tapped, activate only as a sorcery. This is kind of a weird card, and my initial impression is that it isn't that good for limited. This set does have a decent number of artifacts, including treasure, but it doesn't actually let you animate treasure, because they're tokens. That leaves you with only the regular artifacts in the set, and while there are a significant number, I'm not sure they're going to be enough in your typical blue deck to just have this work, since it is completely useless without other artifacts. And really, to take full advantage, you will want a ton of artifacts, because you just want to be able to keep sending in the 4/4 until your opponent kills it. If you can't move on and make a new 4/4 right away after the first one goes down, it'll sort of feel like you're getting 2 for 1, because the Black Staff is suddenly doing nothing, and they killed your creature. I just think it will be too difficult to get enough artifacts to consistently make use of the Black Staff of Waterdeep, certainly in the early game, which is when it will be at its best. It'll just be hard to do in limited. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Blue Dragon, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield until your next turn, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-0, up to 1 other target creature gets -2/-0, and up to 1 other target creature gets -1/-0. That's a pretty wacky Into the Battlefield ability, and it seems pretty nice. It weakens all of those creatures until your next turn, so you can take advantage of their lower power immediately when you play the dragon, which might enable you to attack more, and then you can also benefit from the fact that they won't be able to attack you as effectively once it's your opponent's turn. This does cost 7, but it also impacts the board in an immediate way and gives you a pretty imposing 5/5 flyer. Still, there will be times when the ability doesn't do much either way, and I think that holds it back some. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Charmed Sleep, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted creature, and the enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. Blue doesn't always receive premium removal at common and limited formats, but I think this does get there, if only barely. I think this card's really going to be a B-. It's a card we've seen before, and it does a pretty good job of shutting down most creatures. Now, it does not stop creatures with static abilities or activated abilities, and that can be frustrating sometimes. It can also be bounced. The creature can be bounced. Stuff can go wrong, but this deals with things efficiently enough and permanently enough that I do think it's premium. I'm giving it that B-. Next up, it's Clever Conjurer, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/3 gnome wizard at common, and you can tap it to untap target permanent not named Clever Conjurer, activate only as a sorcery. This ability only being sorcery speed is a little bit of a bummer, but it's still pretty useful to have on a 3 mana 2/3. Notably, it can untap lands for you, helping you ramp, and that's probably the way you'll use it the most. This seems like a solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Contact Other Plane, which for 3 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you get to draw 2 cards. If you roll 10 through 19, you scry 2 and draw 2 cards. And if you roll a 20, you scry 3 and then draw 3 cards. With a 1 through 9, you're getting an instant speed divination that costs 1 extra, which isn't great, but it isn't the worst fail case when the 10 to 19 gives you a pretty great effect for the cost. Like Behold the Multiverse without Foretell, and that's a good place to be. Obviously, rolling the 20 will just be insane. We have to sort of think about what the average case is with this card. You know, if you always rolled a 10 through 19, it would probably be a B. And if you're always rolling a 1 through 9, it's probably a C. I think in the end, this does enough to be first pickable in some weaker packs. I think it's a pretty good common for blue, and I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Demi Lich, which for 4 blue mana is a 4/3 skeleton wizard at Mythic Rare. This spell costs 1 blue less to cast for each instant and sorcery spell you've cast this turn. When it attacks, you exile up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard, copy it, you may cast that copy, and you may cast Demi Lich from your graveyard by exiling 4 instant and or sorcery cards from your graveyard, in addition to paying its other costs. I'm This card has a super neat design, and I bet if I actually knew anything about D&D, I would think the flavor is neat too. But yeah, this guy looks primed to be insane in multiple constructed formats, but it will be challenging to make work in limited. You can't really count on casting a bunch of spells in a turn to make the casting cost much more manageable. Unless you're mono blue, you'll probably need to cast at least 2 spells ahead of this to be able to cast it reliably. Obviously, the attack trigger is great, but remember it also requires you to have some mana to actually cast the spell that you copy, since it says cast it. So you don't just stick the copy of the spell on the stack like effects that just say copy target spell. Now, casting that spell is pretty nice, as it is effectively an extra card in your hand, and a 4/3 will often at least trade in combat, so you get a 2-for-1. And lastly, the ability to come back from the graveyard is also going to be interesting, but hard to make work. Overall, unless you're mono blue and a super spell-heavy mono blue deck, you probably won't be able to play this card, and I wouldn't recommend going hardcore mono blue just for one copy of this. You just won't be casting 4 spells in a turn and playing this for free and limited, and you'll be lucky to get it down to blue-blue even. So, in the end, I guess this deserves a build-around grade, because it's obviously insanely powerful in a deck that gets there on spells. It will probably be a D+ in your typical blue deck, and a B in a deck that really got there. Obviously, in the most ideal deck ever, it's an A+, but I don't think you'll ever be able to draft a deck that this is an A+ in, so that's why I keep the grade at B. Next up, it's Displacer Beast, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 cat beast at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to return it to its owner's hand. This is a strong uncommon. It has sort of passable stats, especially because it does a whole lot more than just sit around as a 3-mana 3/2. The end of the battlefield trigger will be quite nice, as venturing will give you some very significant value. It isn't quite Professor of Symbology, but I think the comparison helps illustrate why this card will be good. The fact it can bounce itself back to your hand won't always come up, but in the late game, it can help you venture through a dungeon all on its own, and that will often be a pretty big deal. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Jeannie Winds here, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 3/3 Djinn at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you roll a D20. If you roll a 1 through 9, you get Scry 1, 10 through 19, you get Scry 2, and with 20, you Scry 3. I was already pretty sold on a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, so adding the D20 effect is just gravy. Even just scrying 1 with this will feel like you're getting nice value, and sometimes it will do more than that. This set also has some D20 payoffs, especially in blue-red, making this marginally better than it might have been otherwise. It isn't the most exciting card, but it's a pretty darn good common and a contender for blue's best. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Dragon Turtle, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 3/5 Dragon Turtle. At rare, it's got flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you tap it, and up to 1 target creature an opponent controls, they don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. This has a cool design. You get a super efficient creature who can lock down an opposing creature for a turn, though it does have to tap itself down too. One thing to keep in mind though, if you play this on your opponent's turn, it will mean that your Dragon Turtle untaps before their creature does, since your next turn will be more immediate. And that means that Dragon Turtle will get to take advantage of the thing being tapped down for 1 attack. Either way, this will be a good way to slow down the opponent while also adding to your own board, even if the creature can't immediately get in there for damage. This seems like a high quality card to me, one you'll first pick a lot. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Eccentric Apprentice, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Tiefling Wizard at uncommon. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've completed a dungeon, up to 1 target creature becomes a bird with base power and toughness 1/1 and flying until end of turn. This is another really strong uncommon for blue. Starts out as a Windrake and has an enter the battlefield venture effect. And I would already be playing that card a lot and pretty happy about it. But then once you complete a dungeon, it has a pretty powerful effect. Turning another creature into a 1/1 flyer can either help you chip in for more damage or severely weaken an opposing creature. There really seems to be plenty of venturing in this set, so completing dungeons isn't going to be crazy far-fetched, especially if you're choosing the 2 dungeons that it's easier to complete. You shouldn't quite count on it always being the case that you can do the completed dungeon part of the card, but the Apprentice will probably be fully upgraded a decent chunk of the time, and that's awesome. This is a B+. Next up, it's Feywild Trickster, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/2 Gnome Warlock at uncommon, and it says whenever you roll 1 or more dice, create a 1/1 blue fairy dragon creature token with flying. How good this card is will be super dependent on the rest of your deck, since a Grey Ogre is just a horrible stat line these days. The good news is, as long as you get 1 token out of this, you're probably doing alright, and more than that will be incredibly powerful. Still, while D20s are around in this set and we've already seen a lot of cards with them, you probably need 5 or more cards that involve them for this to do its thing, and for that reason I do think it needs a build-around grade. I think it's probably a D in your typical blue deck, and a B- in a deck that manages to get there on die roll effects. Next up, it's Fly, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon enchantment aura with Enchant Creature. An enchanted creature has flying, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. So, when we see an aura that grants flying to a creature and draws you a card, it tends to be playable, while again, venturing into a dungeon a single time won't quite be as good as drawing a card. Most of the time, if you do it twice, it will feel like a whole card's worth of value, and that will make up for the risk of getting 2 for 1 when your opponent kills what this is attached to. Now, your creature does have to hit your opponent to get the effect, and that isn't guaranteed or anything, but it seems like on a lot of boards, giving a creature these abilities will make it a big problem for your opponent, giving this a C. Next up, it's Grazolax, Illithid Scholar, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a 3/2 legendary horror at rare. And whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you can return it to its owner's hand. And whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So if any of your creatures are blocked, instead of combat damage actually happening, this can let you return that creature to your hand. It won't always be worth doing, but the great thing here is that it's a May ability. So any combat your creature can win, you just let happen. If your creature will die in combat, you probably want to return it to your hand. This can be especially spicy with Enter the Battlefield abilities, but also just allows for pretty much free attacks. And those free attacks are extra spicy because of the fact that you also draw a card anytime 1 or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player. Keep in mind, because of how that's worded, you can only draw 1 card per combat, but that's still incredibly strong. This is a great card for 3 mana that can sometimes take over games. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Guild Thief, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/1 Orc Rogue at uncommon. When it deals combat damage to a player, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can pay 3 generic and a blue to make it unblockable this turn. It's nice that this becomes larger when it hits players, but as a 2 mana 1/1, it won't be doing that a whole lot without some significant help. It can eventually become unblockable, of course, but paying 4 to make your 1/1 unblockable is going to feel really bad sometimes, especially because the Thief is so darn easy to kill. Sometimes you'll be able to get a blocker out of the way and really get going with it though. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Imrith, Desert Doom, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 5/5 legendary dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. It has ward 4 as long as it's untapped, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Then, if you have fewer than 3 cards in your hand, you draw cards equal to the difference. This really reminds me of Dragon Lord Ojutai, and that's a great comparison, since that card was a massive bomb. The ward effect will make it so you get to attack your opponent with it at least once in most cases, and if you're attacking with a 5/5 flyer, there's a good chance that you will either draw a card or force them to chump. Either way, you're getting at least a 2 for 1 out of the exchange, and that's kind of the best case for your opponent, because if you just start drawing cards off of this, the game's over for them. This is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Mind Flayer, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 horror at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of target creature for as long as you control Mind Flayer. Mind control effects are one of the most powerful things in Magic, especially in Limited. Stealing an opposing creature means you add to the board while subtracting from theirs, and that is huge. Mind Flayer does come with the downside of not being anywhere near a permanent version of the effect, since as a 3/3, it can be easily killed and your opponent can get the creature back. But the upside here is crazy, as getting a 3/3 plus whatever your opponent's best creature is will always be worth 5 mana. I do think the vulnerability of the Flayer keeps this out of bomb range, but just barely. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Mordenkainen, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a mythic rare legendary planeswalker, Mordenkainen, that starts with 5 loyalty. He's got a +2 that says draw 2 cards, then put a card from your hand on the bottom of your library, a -2 that creates a blue dog illusion creature token with this creature's power and toughness are each equal to twice the number of cards in your hand, and he has an ultimate that's a -10 that says exchange your hand in library, then shuffle. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. If you're paying 6 for a planeswalker, he better be amazing, and Mordenkainen is. The best limited planeswalkers are ones that can do at least 2 of the 3 following things: draw you cards, protect themselves, or act as removal. Mordenkainen does the first 2 of those. His +2 gives you some powerful card draw and selection that rapidly raises his loyalty, and his -2 creates a token that can protect him. Now, it is a little bit annoying that you have to make sure you have at least 1 card in your hand all the time for the token to not die, but the upside is that you can also make it significantly larger. 2 cards in your hand makes it a 4/4, and that's just going to happen a lot, especially because he draws you cards. If you manage to get to his ultimate, he'll then draw you a whole bunch of cards, and it's hard to lose at that point. Mostly, you'll probably alternate between +2 and -2 with him most of the time, and that will be plenty to win you the game. Mordenkainen is a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Mordenkainen's Polymorph, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature becomes a dragon with base power and toughness 4/4 and gains flying. Mordenkainen's Polymorph is not nearly as good as Mordenkainen himself. This kind of card always looks really cool, and that's because it's easy to think of situations where it does something. But even though there are several of them, like making a creature big enough to block something it couldn't before, or shrinking an opposing creature, or doing 4 lethal damage in the air, or saving a creature from damage-based removal, even with all those possibilities, you'd be surprised how infrequently a situation emerges where this will actually be worth doing. We've seen a lot of cards like this over the years, and they always significantly underperform, and I don't see that changing here. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Pixie Guide, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 1/3 fairy at common. It's got flying, and if you would roll 1 or more dice, instead roll that many dice +1 and ignore the lowest roll. This has a reasonable floor. 2 mana 1/3 flyers tend to be sort of acceptable and limited, and the upside here is pretty alright too. Blue-red especially will be able to take advantage of the effect, but most decks that are at least part blue will have 2 to 3 cards that involve a d20, so it will come up some in basically any blue deck. This isn't especially close to good, though it's not bad either. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Power of Persuasion, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose target creature an opponent controls, then roll a d20. If you get a 1 through 9, you return it to its owner's hand. If you get 10 through 19, you put it on top or bottom of their library. Actually, they decide whether it goes on top or bottom. And if you roll a 20, you gain control of it until the end of your next turn. So rolling 1 through 9 here isn't going to feel great, as you're just not getting your 3 mana's worth most of the time to bounce something at sorcery speed. But the good news is that the other rolls will give you a little bit more than you'd expect, and that's a pseudo time ebb effect for 10 to 19, and a temporary mind control for 20. The 10 to 19 effect actually lets you go 1 for 1 on cards, and obviously the mind control will feel like a 2 for 1. So the 1 through 9 might be a bit of a bummer, but hey, at least it interacts with the opposing board and gets something off of it, which will at least give you some tempo. I think the whole package here is good enough for a C+. Next up, it's Ray of Frost, which for 1 generic and a blue is an uncommon enchantment aura. It's got flash, it's got enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, if enchanted creature is red, you tap it, and if the enchanted creature is red, it loses all abilities. Enchanted creature doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This whole cycle of color hosers is nice because they're all perfectly playable cards, even if you don't play against the color they hate on, and when you do play against them, the cards in this cycle get a massive upgrade, and that's certainly the case here. The fact that this doesn't tap the creature itself is a pretty big downside, as you have to wait until your opponent has a tapped creature for it to do something. The fact it has flash does make it easier for you to find that window, but if this card didn't have the red hating upside, it would probably just be a C. With it, it's probably a C+, and obviously against red decks that have targets for this, it will feel like a B. I think all of that makes this a C+ overall. Next up, it's Rime Shield Frost Giant, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is a 4/5 giant warrior at common with Ward 3. Ward 3 is pretty big, and for a creature this size, it may just feel like hexproof some games, since your opponent will need a pretty hefty removal spell to deal with it in most cases, and it will be pretty hard for your opponent to ever take it down without paying at least whatever you paid for the giant. It still doesn't have super impressive stats, but they're serviceable. This looks like a really good place to put auras like Fly. Overall, I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Scion of Stigia, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 2/1 tiefling shaman at common. It's got flash. When it enters the battlefield, you choose target creature an opponent controls, and then you roll a d20. 1 through 9 taps that creature, and 10 through 20 taps that creature, and it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. If you know me, you know I'm a pretty big fan of blue creatures with bounce or tap down effects, and this is a d20 version of it that seems pretty good. The nice thing about it is, even if you roll 1 through 9 with it, you're getting a reasonable amount of value out of a 3 mana 2/1, and a tap down might prevent an attack or enable a better one for you. Then, if you hit 10 through 20, which is slightly more likely, you're going to feel like you got a great deal. Basically, 1 through 9 will feel like a C- or a C, and 10 through 20, and you'll feel like you're getting at least a B-. The random of this, of course, makes that frustrating sometimes, but I think this is about a C+. Next up, it's Secret Door, which for 1 blue mana is a 0/4 wall at common with Defender, and you can pay 4 generic and a blue to venture into the dungeon as a sorcery. In the early game, this can block reasonably well, and in the late game, it has an ability that is a reasonable mana sink, and one that can actually give you a ton of value. Only venturing at sorcery speed is rough. I mean, that is what most of these cards do, but you have to take that into account when evaluating them, because you have to telegraph to your opponent you won't be interacting with them. But if you're flooding out, this ability is going to look pretty good. You probably still don't play this a ton, though. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Shocking Grasp, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant that it says target creature gets -2/-0 until end of turn, draw a card. The effect here isn't very exciting. This blue combat trick really needs your board to already have something big enough to deal with an attacking creature or to blow up a block, and that really makes them pretty unimpressive. Obviously, adding a cantrip to the card makes it significantly better because it means that at worst you're going to be able to cycle this, but it still isn't something that will make the cut in your deck all that often, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Shortcut Seeker, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 2/5 human rogue at common, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you venture into the dungeon. This has some okay defensive stats, but unfortunately it needs to do damage to a player to actually do something real, making it kind of an odd card. Blue-black is going to be pretty good at making creatures gain evasion, but I'm still not really impressed with this. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Silver Raven, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 artifact creature bird at common with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you scry 1. 1 mana 1/1 flyers don't tend to be very impressive in most limited formats unless they have a lot going on, and while scry 1 is a little more than nothing, it isn't that great either. It does mean it still does a thing in the late game, and improving your draws matters, but this is pretty mediocre overall. If the set had more of an artifact theme, it would be better, but it just isn't there for the most part. I want this to be good. After all, it is a bird, but it's probably just a C-. Something that is fine, but will get cut a lot. Next up, it's Soul Knife Spy, which for 2 generic and a blue is a 3/2 elf rogue at common, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Creatures with this combat trigger tend to be pretty nice and limited, and this one has more reasonable stats than the ones we usually see at lower rarities. Drawing a card is big, and is the kind of thing your opponent will have to account for one way or another, or the extra card this gets you will help you win a game. It doesn't hurt that blue-black has a significant number of ways to make this creature evasive, either. Again, this is another good place to put Fly. Overall, I think this is a pretty good comment. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Split the Party, which for 3 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose target player, return half the creatures they control to their owner's hand, rounded up. This is a unique design for a bounce spell, and I think most of the time it will be pretty alright. You probably want to be bouncing at least 2 things with it to feel good about the amount of mana you spend on it, and you can do that as long as they have 3 creatures, since it is rounded up. There will be times where it just doesn't matter though, even when you bounce a couple of things or more. A decent chunk of the time, this will just delay the inevitable. This kind of effect does not allow you to trade card for card and is pure tempo, so keep that in mind. There also will be times where you cast this and getting rid of a bunch of blockers helps you win the game. I think overall, this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Sudden Insight, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is an uncommon instant, and it says draw a card for each different mana value among non-land cards in your graveyard. This won't always be easy to get going, especially because the set doesn't really have a big graveyard theme, but in the late game, it seems pretty likely to draw you 3+ cards, and obviously it can do more than that. It does cost 6, and it's utterly terrible until the relatively late game, so it is hard to get overly excited about it, but I think it is a decent draw spell to have a single copy of in your blue decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Tasha's Hideous Laughter, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a rare sorcery, and it says each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with total mana value 20 or more. Well, this is interesting. I tend to be skeptical of mill in most formats where it really isn't a dedicated archetype, and it's not here, but I kind of think a good control deck can probably treat Tasha's Hideous Laughter as a win condition. Your opponent's deck will have 33 cards in it at the beginning of the game, and obviously the number gets continually smaller. Hideous Laughter won't always work out the way you want it to. Hitting, 5 drops with this isn't going to feel great, but I think milling about 10 cards with it is a reasonable expectation, and sometimes it'll do significantly more. But 10 is probably a reasonable expectation. Decks are small enough, and this mills enough cards, that it should have some real potential. It doesn't have to mill your opponent out entirely, it just has to mill them a bunch of cards, and then you have to slow the game down, which you'll be able to do in a controlling deck. Still, that's probably the only place where this is worthwhile. You'll never put this in any sort of deck that's seeking to win the game with creatures in a normal way, and I think that holds it to a C. Next up, it's Trickster's Talisman, which for 1 blue mana is an artifact equipment at uncommon. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice Trickster's Talisman. If you do, create a token that's a copy of this creature, and it has an equip cost of 2. This gives kind of a decent bonus for the cost, and the option to give up the talisman to copy a creature is going to be pretty busted sometimes. I think this seems pretty strong, giving it a B-. Next up, it's True Polymorph, which for 4 generic and 2 blue is a rare instant, and it says target artifact or creature becomes a copy of another target artifact or creature. This is really expensive, but it can really reshape the board in a big way. You can use it to make an opposing creature into the weakest creature on the table, or you can make one of yours a copy of the best creature. You can do it at instant speed too, which means in some cases this can turn into a removal spell of sorts. But this kind of spell is always way more narrow than it looks. You have to significantly upgrade or downgrade a creature for the massive mana cost to be worth it, and you'll find yourself staring at boards pretty often where this just won't do the thing you need it to do. I feel like this is both too narrow and too expensive to be something you want to play most of the time, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Wizard class, which for 1 blue mana is an uncommon enchantment with the class subtype. So this is a new type of enchantment we have in this set. They all start out at level 1 and give you some effect, and then you can pay some amount of mana to level them up to level 2. Once you're at level 2, you can level them up to level 3 by paying some mana, and the more levels you get, the more effects you get, because you just get everything by the time you level it up to level 3. So Wizard class starts out with you have no maximum hand size. You can then pay 2 generic and a blue to level it up to level 2, at which point you draw 2 cards. And then once you're at level 2, you can pay 4 generic and a blue, and it says whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This is a little less build-aroundy than some of the other classes, and that's pretty good news because it will be nice in pretty much any blue deck, though it does get better the more cards you draw. The level 1 enchantment is pretty bad, but drawing 2 at level 2 will feel nice, and obviously leveling this up all the way will feel awesome, as getting a counter every turn is quite nice. That said, it's also incredibly slow. Getting it to level 3 is going to take a long time, and that holds it back significantly. But I think it looks pretty nice overall, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Wizard's Spellbook, which for 5 generic and 2 blue is a rare artifact, and it says exile target instant or sorcery card from a graveyard, roll a d20, activate only as a sorcery. If you roll a 1 through 9, you copy that card and you can cast the copy. If you roll 10 through 19, you copy that card and you may cast the copy by paying 1 rather than paying its mana cost. And if you roll a 20, you copy each card exiled with Wizard's Spellbook. You may cast any number of the copies without paying their mana costs. This thing is slow, but boy, is it going to win you the game if you get to use it even twice. Any of the rolls are pretty darn good. 1 to 9 lets you flash back a spell, 10 to 19 lets you cast it for 1, and 20 is going to let you cast everything that's ever been exiled with Spellbook for free. This does cost 7, but if you play it when you have 8, you can at least take a crack at copying a spell that first turn. Sometimes you won't be able to do that, and that will feel kind of rough, paying 7 for something that doesn't actually affect the board right away. But luckily the ability costs 0, so thereafter, you'll be able to use it to great effect for the remainder of the game. It's still hard to get over how slow this is, and this format doesn't exactly appear to be a super slow one, but I'm pretty high on this card to start the format. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's You Come to a River, which for 1 generic and a blue is a common instant, and it says choose one, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, or target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. This is a nice modal card. Usually, just a card that does the fight the current option is something that makes the cut a decent chunk of the time. It has the flexibility of dealing, at least temporarily, with multiple permanent types, and you can even use it to actually take away a card permanently if your opponent tries to put auras or combat tricks on their creatures. You'll really only choose the other option when it's either lethal or you have a creature with a good combat damage trigger, but that's some nice upside to have on an already solid card. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's You Find the Villain's Lair, which for 1 generic and 2 blue is a common instant, and it says choose one, counter target spell, or draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Cancel is usually not a great card in Limited. Counterspells are a little too situational, and it is often just going to be better to add to your board with 3 mana than count on your opponent to play something you can counter. In a lot of ways, counter magic in Limited is just bad removal, because you have to have the mana up to use it at the exact right time, or it doesn't do anything. Basically, a card like Cancel just ends up being a card you have left in your hand after you've played everything else, and then it might do something, but it may also have cost you the game. This gets around that problem with another mode though. Sure, it doesn't add to the board either, but it still gives you something to do with it that will be more immediate and more of a sure thing in situations where using it as a counterspell isn't a good idea. Normally, cancel is like a D+, but I think the extra mode here is enough to get it up to a C-. Next up, it's You See a Guard Approach, which for 1 blue mana is a common instant, and it says choose one. Tap target creature, or target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. Individually, these effects are not worth an entire card. They're just too situational. Sure, it feels good to give your creature hexproof in response to removal, but there will be lots of times where that effect just doesn't do anything. The tap effect is even more underwhelming, and while it can allow you to stop something from attacking you or maybe help you attack more effectively, it will also be useless a decent chunk of the time. Each of these cards individually would be like a D- at best. If you put them together, you're obviously ending up with a better card that you'll actually be able to use sometimes, but I still don't think it's more than a D+. Next up, it's Yuan T Malison, which for 1 generic and a blue is a 2/1 snake rogue at rare. It can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you venture into the dungeon. This is a very powerful 2-drop, the kind that can take over a game, and that's not something one often says about 2-drops. It can be unblockable for as long as you want it to be, and that part of the card alone would be a card you basically never cut. The adventure trigger is amazing though, and will quickly give you a ton of value. Left unchecked, this 2-drop can legitimately end games. I do think it falls a little short of bomb status since it's so easy to kill, but it gets about as close as any 2-drop can get. I'm giving it a B+. Alright, those are all the blue cards. Let's move into black now. Our first black card is Acererak, the Archlich. For 2 generic and a black, it's a 5/5 legendary zombie wizard at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, you return Acererak to its owner's hand and venture into the dungeon. When Acererak the Archlich attacks, for each opponent you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, unless that player sacrifices a creature. So, up until you complete the Tomb of Annihilation, this is basically a 3-mana spell that says venture into the dungeon that you can cast every turn. If that's all this was, you probably wouldn't play it, but it wouldn't be a complete disaster. Think of it like having a mana sink that lets you venture, and you can see how nice that can be in the later part of the game to grind out value. Then, once you do complete the dungeon, you get a 5/5 who will either make your opponent sacrifice a creature or give you a zombie when it attacks. So, the tricky thing here is that you're basically never going to play Acererak as a creature permanently on turn 3, like one wants to do. Tomb of Annihilation is the easiest of the dungeons to complete, since one can do it in 3 ventures. However, it's definitely the trickiest of the dungeons to take advantage of, as a result of the fact that its first 2 effects are either symmetrical bad things, or just bad things that happen to you up until you reach the last room. But with all that in mind, Acererak still seems really good. He lets you venture, which there's all sorts of synergy for in this set, and he's a large, scary threat at pretty much any stage of the game. I don't quite think Acererak will be a bomb because the setup cost is very real, but it's close. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Asmodeus, the Archfiend, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 6/6 legendary devil god at rare. If you would draw a card, you exile the top card of your library face down instead. You can pay 3 black to draw 7 cards, and you can pay 1 black to return all cards exiled with Asmodeus, the Archfiend, to their owner's hand, and you lose that much life. This has a cool design. 6 mana 6/6s tend to be okay in limited, and there is a downside here, sort of, in the case that you don't really get to draw cards when it's in play, instead they get exiled. You can get those cards back though, but it will cost you some mana and some life. Paying 3 black to draw 7 and then an additional black to get those 7 cards will cost a lot of life, but it seems like in most scenarios you will get a pretty insurmountable card advantage out of that, and 7 life will be worth it. The fact it costs triple black to draw those 7 is a problem in limited. You just won't have that kind of mana regularly in limited. In general, I think Asmodeus will sometimes feel like more downside than upside in limited, but the amount of power he brings is pretty amazing. I do think the downside here is significant enough that he's not particularly close to being a bomb, but he's still really strong. I'm giving him a B. Next up, it's Baleful Beholder, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 6/5 Beholder at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you can choose 2 options. One of them is each opponent sacrifices an enchantment, or creatures you control gain menace until end of turn. If you're looking for some kind of top curve in a black deck, the Beholder isn't a terrible place to turn. Sometimes giving menace to your whole team will just win you the game on the spot. Other times, it won't do anything. The average situation's probably somewhere in the middle. It lets you attack with 1 or 2 things that couldn't. But that's not bad when it's attached to a 6-mana 6/5. Additionally, the fact it can get rid of enchantments in a pinch is nice too, especially if your opponent has sunk a bunch of resources into leveling up a class enchantment. You probably don't want more than one copy of this just because it's so expensive, but I think you should value the first copy reasonably high, especially for a common, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Black Dragon, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-3 until end of turn. This is expensive, but it will have a huge impact on the board when you play it. It will virtually always be able to kill something of your opponents, and trust me, playing a 4/4 flyer and subtracting from your opponent's board is pretty game-changing. It won't always let you take down their biggest, baddest creature, but this card will still swing games in your favor pretty effectively. It's an impressive uncommon. If this format ends up being really fast, it may slip a little bit, but for now, I think it's a pretty high pick, giving it a B-. Next up, it's the Book of Vile Darkness, which costs 3 black mana for a mythic rare legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, if you lost 2 or more life this turn, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. You can tap it and exile the Book of Vile Darkness and artifacts you control named Eye of Vecna and Hand of Vecna, and we saw those in yesterday's video. They're both pretty good artifacts. They're both rare, though. And if you do that, you create Vecna, a legendary 8/8 black zombie god creature token with Indestructible, and it gains all triggered abilities of the exiled cards. So, setting things up to make the zombie god, it's not going to happen in Limited without insane luck. So, we'll disregard that. Mostly, this will give you a zombie at the end of your turn if you lost 2 or more life. And there just aren't enough ways in this format to do that. So basically, this has 2 effects that it will be near impossible to trigger, especially consistently. Basically, you're not going to be able to get a 2/2 zombie out of this very consistently, and 1 wouldn't really be enough anyway, and you're basically never going to get the zombie god either, because you need this mythic rare and 2 rares, both of which are also just pretty good anyway, so it's not like nobody else will take them. They'll be picking them. So, unfortunately, the Book of Vile Darkness is just a straight-up F. Just won't work in this format. Next up, it's Check for Traps, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, exile that card. If an instant card or a card with flash is exiled this way, they lose 1 life, otherwise, you lose 1 life. This kind of discard spell is usually pretty solid and limited. The fact it can hit anything is a big deal, and means that it has utility pretty much all game long. The additional instant/flash upside can even matter a little bit. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Clattering Skeletons, which for 3 generic and a black is a 4/3 skeleton at common, and when it dies, you venture into the dungeon. A 4-mana 4/3 is kind of okay, and this comes with a nice death trigger. As we've been saying, Venture is going to be a big part of this format, so any card that can do it for you is going to be a little better than it looks, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Deadly Dispute, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, draw 2 cards, and create a treasure token. So, if you've watched my past reviews, you know I usually give something like Village Rites like a D+. It's not something you usually play, but it can sort of work out for you sometimes. But I think in this particular format, a Village Rites-like effect is going to be pretty good, and that's largely because of the prevalence of Treasure, which is going to be the Black-Red deck's theme, and that'll make this considerably better than it looks. This kind of effect often plays like Tormenting Voice, which is to say, it's pretty replaceable, but I think this will be better than usual thanks to all of that treasure, and it also produces treasure, so you don't even lose treasure once this resolves, you get that treasure back. It, of course, still comes with the upside of being able to sacrifice a creature in response to removal, at which point you really aren't going down a card either. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Death Priest of Mir, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 2/2 Tiefling Cleric at uncommon, and it gives skeletons, vampires, and zombies you control +1/+1. And at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 1 generic mana, and if you do, you make a 1/1 black skeleton creature token. This card feels like a rare, and that's always a good sign for an uncommon. Sure, it has some ugly stats for the cost, but everything else going on here is great. There are enough creatures with those types in black in this set that it will be pumping 3 to 5 creatures in your deck, and sometimes more, but the real power comes from the ability to make 1/1 skeletons, which, if the Death Priest is in play, will of course be 2/2 skeletons. You won't always be able to trigger that effortlessly, but it will happen often enough for the Death Priest to be a very real problem for your opponent. And the great thing is, after you make that first one, you're going to be getting value even if they find removal for your Death Priest. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Demogorgon's Clutches, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target opponent discards 2 cards, mills 2 cards, and loses 2 life. They continue to print Mind Rots that are at least kind of okay and limited, and that's a good trend, I think. The problem with the discard part of this card is how much its usefulness decreases in the late game. Like, it is usually a god-awful top deck to draw your Mind Rot late, and early it's often better to just add to the board. So there's sort of a sweet spot of a few turns where you feel that a Mind Rot effect will be at its best, and that's why most Mind Rots are like a D+. However, by adding some additional effects to the card, in this case, the part where your opponent loses 2 life, it makes it so this Mind Rot actually does something, even late. Now, it still isn't good, mind you, but it is better than most Mind Rots, and I think that's enough for it to be a C-. Next up, it's Devour Intellect, which for 1 black mana is a common sorcery, and it says target opponent discards a card. If mana from a treasure was spent to cast this spell, instead, that player reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card. Letting your opponent choose to discard whatever they want with this is not going to be good, but with Treasure, you can turn it into a better Thoughtseize, and that's pretty neat. I think this really needs a build-around grade because it's pretty awful in a deck with 0 treasure, but if you're black-red, you'll probably have the treasure you need to make this work pretty well. Still, a card like this is better in the early game and has diminishing returns as the game goes on, and you can't count on having treasure early, so don't expect to fire this off on turn 1 or 2 for the most effective mode. I think this is an F in a typical black deck in the format, and probably a C in like a black-red deck with a lot of treasure. I can't see the ceiling going much higher than that, mostly because even with a lot of treasure lying around, you won't always be able to use this effectively. Next up, it's Drider, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/3 elf spider at uncommon with reach, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you get a 2/1 black spider creature token with menace and reach. This doesn't have great base stats, but it does have a good combat damage trigger. Even just getting 1 spider out of this will feel great, and it feels like blue-black is well equipped with enough ways to make this evasive that it will feel pretty strong when it lines up that way. It won't always do that though, and sometimes it will just be an inefficient creature, so I think this lands at a C+. Next up, it's Dungeon Crawler, which for 1 black mana is a 2/1 zombie at uncommon. It enters the battlefield tapped, and whenever you complete a dungeon, you can return Dungeon Crawler from your graveyard to your hand. It's pretty fun. Gravecrawler reference. 1 mana 2/1s don't tend to be amazing and limited, largely because everyone plays lots of creatures and they'll get bigger than it in a hurry. However, the upside of this returning to your hand when you complete a dungeon is pretty nice. Even if it is just a 2/1, getting it back even once per game will feel pretty alright. And if you're in black, I think it is pretty likely you complete at least 1 dungeon over the course of the game. I think this is a C. Next up, it's Feign Death, Draco Lich, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 5/2 legendary zombie dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flash, it's got flying, it enters the battlefield tapped, and you may cast Feign Death, Draco Lich from your graveyard if a creature not named Feign Death, Draco Lich died this turn. A 4 mana 5/2 flyer with flash is already a great card, probably, at least a B, even coming into play tapped. That's just a ton of damage and very efficient. So, the fact that Draco Lich can come back from your graveyard is a big deal. The requirement is that you have to have a creature not named Feign Death, Draco Lich, die on your turn to use the ability. So that means if you chump block something, you can get it back. That means if you sacrifice a creature, you can get it back. And sometimes you can go into combat with this and attack with your whole board. Your opponent has to block, and you can still bring the Draco Lich back because some of your other creatures died. All that has to happen is 1 creature not named Feign Death, Draco Lich dies. It can die on the turn, it just has to have something else die with it. So the point is, it's really not that hard to get it to come back. It's nice that it counts any turn, unlike some of the other morbid effects in this set that only look at your turn. So Feign Death, Draco Lich is a bomb. He's a huge flyer that's going to come back throughout the game and eventually just kill your opponent. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Eyes of the Beholder, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a common instant, and it says target creature gets -11 until end of turn. It's pretty difficult for a card to be premium removal when it costs 6 mana, unless of course it also draws you a card like Rise of Extus and Strixhaven. Eye of the Beholder can definitely kill almost anything, but 6 mana is a lot. It is an instant, which does mean sometimes you'll be able to make blowouts happen. I think you'll always be reasonably happy with the first copy of this, but running more than that is pretty risky just because it's so expensive. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Fate's Reversal, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, venture into the dungeon. So usually, black has a common that lets you return 2 creatures, and it is usually a serviceable enough card that you basically always want the first copy. They are situational, since they don't do anything until late, but they can really help you grind out a win. This doesn't do that exactly, but I could see it offering somewhat similar value as a creature plus venture won't feel too shabby. I think this is a C. You don't really want more than one copy in most cases, but it is nice that it has a fail case of at least venturing for you, if nothing else. Next up, it's Feign Death, which for 1 black mana is a common instant, and it says until end of turn, target creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Versions of this effect that are good tend to give the stats boost up front. That's significantly better than this because it allows a smaller creature to win combat against something bigger, but this won't do that. Sometimes you'll have to use it on a chump block, and that won't feel great. It is nice that it basically counters most removal, and it isn't terrible. It's just not supernatural stamina or other cards we've seen that have been pretty solid with similar effects. This just won't do enough to make the cut super often. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Forsworn Paladin, which for 1 black is a 1/1 human knight at rare. It's got Menace, and you can pay 1 generic and a black and 1 life to create a treasure token. And it has another ability where you can pay 2 generic and a black. Target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. If mana from treasure was spent to activate that ability, that creature also gains Death Touch until end of turn. This looks really good. First, it provides some nice fixing in RAM since it can churn out treasure, and then it also has an ability that is a pretty potent treasure payoff. Even without treasure, the ability to pump something +2/+0 would feel pretty good, but if you can give that thing Death Touch too, that's when things will really get interesting. This is going to be just great in any deck, but especially in the treasure deck, because one of the things it looks like they want is mana sinks, and Forsworn Paladin is nice there as well. It provides treasure for you, and it's an awesome mana sink. And on top of all of that, it's a 1 mana 1/1 with Menace, a creature that can attack fairly effectively in the early game, and which can pump itself with its own ability. So if you have the ability to give it Death Touch, you'll be taking down 2 things no matter how your opponent blocks. The whole package makes for quite an impressive 1-drop. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Gelatinous Cube, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 4/3 ooze at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-ooze creature an opponent controls until Gelatinous Ooze leaves the battlefield. And you can pay X in a black to put target creature card with mana value X exiled with Gelatinous Cube into its owner's graveyard. A 4 mana 4/3 that exiles an opposing creature is excellent. And sure, if your opponent kills the cube, they're going to get back the creature. But given enough time, you can dissolve that creature, which will make it so they won't get it back. Even without that dissolve effect, this is basically Ravenous Chupacabra, and with the dissolve effect, it's way better. I think this gets into the lower range of bomb territory. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Grim Bounty, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common sorcery that says destroy target creature or planeswalker, create a treasure token. This is premium removal. It might be a somewhat expensive sorcery, but it kills pretty much everything for 4 mana and even gives you treasure back, almost making it so it costs 3 mana with some fixing upside, giving this a B-. Next up, it's Grim Wanderer, which for 1 generic and a black is a 5/3 Goblin Warlock at uncommon. It's got flash, and it says cast this spell only if a creature died this turn. This is a strange card to evaluate. Obviously, on the vanilla test, it's incredible, but the requirement of a creature needing to die is harder to set up than you might think. It does have flash, which means that you can more easily find a situation where you can cast it, but keep in mind, the kind of flash it has will almost never allow you to use it to ambush your opponent because a creature probably won't die until combat. Still, it isn't hard to imagine a situation where you and your opponent trade 2 drops and you play this at the end of their turn, and if you can do that, it will feel pretty good. Even in the late game, a 5/3 isn't too bad, and you may be able to double spell because it is so cheap. It does have a massive downside, though. You literally can't cast it at all if something hasn't died. It would be much better even if it had an alternate option where you play like 6 or 7 or something like that as a base cost, and then it gets reduced when something dies. But sometimes this will just be stuck in your hand, or to get it going, you have to block in an ugly way or something like that, and that really tempers my expectations here. I think he's probably just a C. Next up, it's Herald of Hadar, which for 4 generic and a black is a 4/4 human warlock at common and has an activated ability where you can pay 5 generic and a black to roll a d20. And if you roll 1 through 9, each opponent loses 2 life. If you roll 10 through 19, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And if you roll a 20, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, and you make 2 treasure tokens. This is a bit clunky as a 5 mana 4/4, but the activated ability, as expensive as it is a pretty nice late game mana sink, something black-red decks especially might be interested in. The ability, no matter what you roll, provides some serious reach. It is probably still too slow to make the cut on a super regular basis, though. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Hired Hexblade, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 elf warlock at common. When it enters the battlefield, if mana from a treasure was spent to cast it, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is a nice bear. Worst case, that's what you get, a 2 mana 2/2, which is fine, but the upside is that you get to draw a card. There is enough treasure in this set that casting this with it isn't a pipe dream at all, but you probably shouldn't expect to be able to do it consistently on turn 2. Still, playing this later once you have that treasure will be nice since it will have relevance in the late game too when you do it. Giving this a C+. Next up, it's Horde Robber, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/3 Tiefling Rogue at common. When it deals combat damage to a player, you make a treasure token. It's nice that this can make treasure, but a 1/3 just isn't going to be getting in very often without some significant help. I don't think you play this most of the time. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Lightfoot Rogue, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 Halfling Rogue at uncommon. When it attacks, you roll a d20. If you roll a 1 through 9, it gains Death Touch until end of turn. If you roll 10 through 19, it gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. And if you roll a 20, it gets +3/+0 and gains First Strike and Death Touch until end of turn. This is a fine 2-drop, though not an overly impressive one for an uncommon. What you get out of a roll 1 through 10 and 11 through 19 really isn't that different in most scenarios, but it is nice that this gains Death Touch when it attacks, meaning that your opponent has to give something up to kill it. Unfortunately, the format seems to have enough 1/1 tokens lying around that isn't that impressive. Obviously, rolling a 20 with it will be amazing, but it won't do that most of the time. It also has the very real downside of not having Death Touch on defense. One of the nice things about Death Touch is how good it is, both attacking and blocking, but you only get the attack upside here. I think this is just a C. Next, it's Lolth, Spider Queen, who costs 3 generic and 2 black for a legendary Planeswalker Lolth. She starts with 4 loyalty. She's got a static ability that says whenever a creature you control dies, put a loyalty counter on Lolth. And she has a 0 ability that says you draw a card and you lose 1 life. A -3 that says create 2 2/1 black spider creature tokens with menace and reach. And a -8 that says you get an emblem with, whenever an opponent is dealt combat damage by 1 or more creatures you control, if that player lost less than 8 life this turn, they lose life equal to the difference. Well, as is often the case, this is a Planeswalker that is a stone cold bomb. The best limited Planeswalkers tend to need 2 of the following 3, as I said earlier: card draw, a removal effect, and a way to protect themselves. Lolth comes away with 2 of those, and both her main abilities are just great. A 0 loyalty ability that draws you a card is going to be nice if you're ahead, and if you're behind, you can use her -3. And because her spider friends have reach, it is going to be difficult for your opponent to go after Lolth very effectively. Those spiders also have menace, so they can be quite intimidating attackers too. The great thing is that her static ability will give her more loyalty counters, and this means her -3 will feel more like a -2 in some cases. Her ultimate emblem is definitely a weird one, but if you get there, it is the kind that will probably win you the game in the long run, although her spiders and card draw might accomplish that before you ever get to use it. I think she is an amazing bomb, giving her an A+. Next up, it's Manticore, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/1 Manticore. At common, it's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target creature an opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. These type of kill something that was damage effects are often underwhelming, just because it takes more work than you'd think to consistently manufacture situations where that happens. In particular, situations where you can make it happen without giving up resources like an ugly block or attack. However, this has flash added to the mix, and the card gets more interesting because it means there will be a wider variety of situations where you can make that part of the card work. Don't count on this to feel like a flying ravenous chupacabra all the time, but it will do that often enough to be a pretty nice common, and the fail case is still that you get a flyer. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Power Word Kill, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target non-angel, non-demon, non-devil, non-dragon creature. This will be able to kill most stuff really efficiently, and will basically feel like Doomblade, but is probably actually better. Doomblade can't kill a whole color of creatures. Power Word Kill can't hit a few creature types, and at common and uncommon, this set has 1 angel, 0 demons, 0 devils, and 7 dragons, and none of those dragons are common. There are a few more of these things, of course, at rare and mythic, but you get the picture. This kills almost everything and incredibly efficiently. I'm sure there will be frustrating times when you can't kill your opponent's dragon, but most of the time it will do the job very efficiently. This is premium removal and one of the best non-rares in the format. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Precipitous Drop, which for 2 generic and a black is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature, and when it enters into the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon. An enchanted creature gets -2/-2, and it gets -5/-5 instead as long as you've completed a dungeon. I think I would play this most of the time, even without the completed dungeon bonus. The aura plus venture is going to be good enough for that, and then the completed dungeon bonus makes this far more potent. One nice thing about this card is that you can stick it on a creature and then get the dungeon bonus later once you complete a dungeon, at which point it's likely to kill whatever it is. I think this is premium removal. The venturing attached to it is great. I'm giving it a B. It's one of Black's best common, maybe Black's best common. Next up, it's Ray of Enfeeblement, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gets -4/-1 until end of turn. If that creature is white, it gets -4/-4 until end of turn instead. 1 mana for -4/-1 to a creature is already kind of okay. It won't outright kill all of them, but it will certainly enfeeble them enough to be taken down in combat pretty much all the time, and that will feel pretty efficient. Then, against people playing white, it gets a massive upgrade to the point that it's one of the best cards in your deck. I think this is a B-. It has a good baseline coupled with insane upside. Next up, it's Reaper's Talisman, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon artifact equipment. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, it gains Death Touch until end of turn, and whenever equipped creature attacks alone, defending player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. It has an equip cost of 2. This looks like some pretty nice equipment. 1 to play and 2 to equip for Death Touch and the attacks alone trigger is an okay deal, especially because those two things pair so well together. You often will find yourself rumbling with a small Death Toucher anyway, so draining 2 on top of that will be a real problem for your opponent. Keep in mind the creature only has Death Touch on the attack, so don't move this to a blocker and expect it to have Death Touch. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Sepulker Gul, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/1 common zombie, and you can sacrifice another creature to give it +2/+2 until end of turn, but you can only activate it once each turn. This has passable base stats, and on most attacks, it can threaten to become a 4/3, so your opponent will have to take that into account. Free sacrifice effects like this always play pretty well, since you can virtually always use the effect, though in this case, you can only do it once. It looks like the Ghoul is well positioned for the black-green deck especially, since that deck's all about stuff dying, and it will also pair nicely in black-red, where you can use a threaten effect to steal a creature and sacrifice it. I think all of that makes this 2 mana 2/1, a card you play a significant chunk of the time in black. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Shambling Ghast, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 zombie at common. When it dies, you choose one. Target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn, or create a treasure. This is a nice little 1-drop. It can be a real pain if your opponent has 2 X1s in play, since you can make a 2-for-1 out of your 1-drop, and those situations will happen sometimes. And the good news is, when the -1/-1 part isn't useful, and it won't always be, you get to make a treasure, which means this little 1-drop gives you fixing and ramp pretty early on in the game. Seems like a solid playable to me. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Skullport Merchant, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/4 dwarf citizen at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token, and you can pay 1 generic and a black to sacrifice another creature or a treasure to draw a card. So this is basically Black Sailor of Means with upside, and that's a really good place to start. Tacking on fixing and ramp to a creature like this just ends up feeling really great. Sometimes you won't really want the treasure, so it's great that he can cash them in for cards as well as creatures. The fixing and ramp and the reasonable defensive body it supplies are all pretty nice. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Sphere of Annihilation, which for X generic and a black is a rare artifact. It enters the battlefield with X void counters on it, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you exile Sphere of Annihilation. All creatures and planeswalkers with mana value less than or equal to the number of void counters on it, and all creatures and planeswalker cards in graveyards with mana value less than or equal to the number of void counters on it. This is, of course, symmetrical, but because you get to decide the mana to pay for it, you will be able to find a way to make it feel less symmetrical most of the time. It is a big bummer that it doesn't do anything immediately. Waiting a whole turn for it to do its thing will sometimes be too slow, especially if you're behind, so the card is a bit finicky. You need the mana value to line up well, and you need to wait an entire turn for it to do something. Even with all that in mind, though, I think this is a fairly powerful card, though all those variables don't make it a bomb. I think I'm going to start the format valuing it fairly highly and playing it in pretty much any black deck I can get it in. This type of effect just isn't replaceable. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Thieves Tools, which for 1 generic and a black is a common artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token. An equipped creature can't be blocked as long as its power is 3 or less. It has an equip cost of 2. This seems like a pretty solid card. It sort of fulfills what 2 different black decks in the format do. Black-red is really interested in the treasure, and blue-black is really interested in making like smaller creatures evasive so you get their combat damage triggers. Obviously, this makes treasure, and it makes those small creatures unblockable, so you can be getting a venture into the dungeon, trigger, or whatever every single turn. And it comes with the upside of course, giving you some fixing. Seems like a solid piece of equipment to me. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Vampire Spawn, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 vampire at common, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this isn't quite Siege Rhino, but it seems pretty nice. A 3-mana 2/3 isn't really where you want to be, but the enter the battlefield trigger here is real. It is a bit odd that black doesn't really care about life gain this time around, but you will sometimes have white or green cards in your deck that have a life gain payoff that this will help trigger. The drain effect here is a total net gain of 4 life. In other words, it creates a gap of 4 life between you and your opponent, and that's pretty nice in a race. This seems solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Vorpal Sword, which for 1 black is a rare artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has Death Touch. And for 5 generic and 3 black, until end of turn, Vorpal Sword gains whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. That player loses the game, and its equip cost is 2 black mana. +2/+0 when Death Touch is a nice boost for a 1 mana to play and 2 to equip equipment. Now, the equip cost being double black will sometimes be a bummer in the early game, as you can't always get your double colored mana when you want to, but even with that bit of downside, this is going to be great. Virtually every creature you put this on will become a threat, and it can even be used sort of defensively, thanks to Death Touch. The big 8 mana ability might not come up a ton, but it will sometimes, and it's just upside in an already very good card. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Warlock class, which for 1 black mana is an enchantment class at uncommon. Level 1 says at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, each opponent loses 1 life. Level 2, which you can get to for 1 generic and a black, lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library, and you put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. And then for 6 generic and a black, you can get it up to level 3, and at the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses life equal to the life they lost this turn. The level 1 of this wouldn't be worth it on its own, as using up a whole card for a fairly mediocre morbid effect that will only trigger every couple of turns or so just isn't what you want to be doing. Now, it is nice that when you take it to level 2, it draws you a card and gives you some nice card selection, and I do think that if we looked at this as 2 and a black for an enchantment with the morbid ability and the card selection effect, it would be an okay card. Then, in the extreme late game, it can level up and get pretty powerful, but it's worth noting that the effect is really only going to do something if you're already ahead in most cases. I think the whole package here is just a C. Next up, it's Westgate Regent, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 vampire. At rare, it's got flying, it has ward, discard a card, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it. This is great. You would be reasonably happy with a vanilla 5 mana 4/4 flyer, so adding all of this other stuff to it is amazing. First, the ward effect makes it virtually impossible for your opponent not to get 2 for 1 by the Regent, since they will have to discard a card just to target it in the first place. Second, the longer the Regent stays around, the larger it will get as it damages your opponent, accelerating their clock significantly. So he ticks a lot of marks that make him a bomb. He'll win you the game if left unchecked, and because of ward, he will have some negative effect on your opponent even if he dies right away. I'm giving this an A. Next up, it's White, which for 1 generic and a black is a 3/2 zombie soldier at rare. It enters the battlefield tapped, and whenever a creature dealt damage by it this turn dies, you create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token and exile that card. A 2 mana 3/2 that enters tapped would already be a decent playable, but the additional effect here is quite good. Most of the time you won't be making more than 1 zombie, but that's fine. If you are up against this card, trading with it will feel pretty miserable because of that zombie token. You can even triple block something huge to take it down and still get back a little bit of value. Basically, it's a nice attacker and blocker that replaces itself. And that's pretty great for a 2 mana creature. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Yuan T Fangblade, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 snake rogue at common. It's got Death Touch, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you venture into the dungeon. This has a nice combat damage trigger, and because it has Death Touch, your opponent will be put in a difficult position with it sometimes. Repeatable venturing seems pretty powerful, and blue-black seems the most well-positioned to help creatures like this gain evasion. Seems solid enough. I'm giving it a C. And our last black card, and our last card in part 2 of this set review in general, is Zombie Ogre, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a Zombie Ogre. At common, it's a 3/5, and at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you venture into the dungeon. This has kind of decent defensive stats, but the real value comes from its ability to venture into the dungeon, which it can do without any mana investment at all. Sure, you have to have your creature die or an opposing creature has to die, but that's a common enough occurrence that this will be able to venture for you sometimes. Playing it in the second main phase after a creature has already died will feel particularly good because you'll be getting that value at your end step most of the time. This seems like a solid common. I'm giving it a C. Well, those are my thoughts on all the blue and black cards and Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. Tomorrow, I'll be back to wrap up the card-by-card portion of the review with red and green. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this review, there should be a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. Thanks for watching.